After the break. As Britain comes to terms with evidence of an arguable coronavirus manslaughter, we go to the city in India globally supplying AstraZeneca vaccines to ask India's former Drug Administration Commissioner what has gone so wrong in his country. All this and more coming up in part 2 of Going Underground. Welcome back. Tomorrow, the 74th World Health Assembly winds down as tens of millions grieve for relatives killed by coronavirus. Despite Britain having a per capita death rate 10 times that of India, it is the so-called world's largest democracy that is now under the spotlight for its coronavirus response, though. Joining me now from Pune in India is former Principal Secretary to the Government of Maharashtra, Mahesh Zagade. Thanks so much, Mahesh, for coming on. So, as I said, I mean, the rate may be 10 times higher here per capita, but I mean, I may have had the AstraZeneca vaccine here, and it might have been created where you're from, there, Pune, the site of the largest vaccination manufacturer, reportedly. What's gone so wrong? Why are there hundreds of thousands that have been killed in your country?
You have to really think from the two different perspectives. India is having 17.5 to 17.8% of population. That factor one has to keep in mind. And if you really take the factor of the percentage of deaths, then and if you break it down, and if you like world percentage of deaths, then USA and then Brazil, and then of course Germany and France and all that. If you come down to the percentage, then it's too low. It's too low. But unfortunately, the absolute number is too high because the population is too huge, and it is the second largest population in the world after China. We do not know what is happening in China. Probably it is under control. But then, see, the figures in India are all transparent in the public domain. And therefore, because of the size of population, and being the 17.5% population of the world, the deaths or the infection rate is not 17.5. It is much less. Of course, that's not the way it has to be defended. But then we have to also think about these figures, huge figures. If you really talk about the world percentage of the total infection and the deaths of world, and if you take a factor for India, then probably Indians are doing far better because it's not even half the rate of the world average in terms of the death alone.
Okay, well, the variant, the Indian variant, so-called, is certainly, we're having surge testing here in Britain because of it. I just want to ask actually about the factory, the Serum Institute in Pune, because the CEO, Mr. Poonwala, says that he had to flee India because of death threats. So what is going on in Maharashtra that he had to flee the site of his factory, the largest vaccination manufacturing facility in the world?
I think it is not correctly been projected because Mr. Cyrus Poonawala, the chairman, has given a statement, a public statement, that every year they go to UK for holidays during summer. And that's how they have gone to UK. That is his official statement. Now, I don't think there is any reason why I should flee this country, because I'm speaking from Pune. I was a municipal commissioner for this city of Pune, Serum Institute of India. The largest facility for vaccine manufacturing is there, and one of the largest in the world also.
We invite him on to explain it. We'd love him on the show. He does say, though, that Mr. Modi is responsible for ordering too few vaccines. And this coming from someone who, I know his family have financially donated to the Congress Party historically, but he has supported neoliberal policies of the Modi government. What do you make of him saying that your leader ordered just too few vaccines? That's why so many people are dying.
The death of people and vaccination is different. Of course, vaccination is going to be the only savior for the entire planet and not just India, because everybody has to be vaccinated, and listen, until that is done, the world will not come into right order, and this thing is not going to get vanished unless the entire world is vaccinated. But important factor remains is that most of the developed countries, the governments, they invested into the R&D development of the vaccines. And in return, they also had agreements, bilateral, multilateral agreements with the manufacturers or the developers, be it private entities or the public bodies.
That's not what he said at all, though. It's nothing to do with all of that it was in Oxford and it was a deal. He just says Modi ordered too few.
But Indians, they probably could have invested, or they could have, given the mere size of the population, they could have joined the bandwagon initially only when the vaccination research was going on. that time they could have, secure supply of vaccines. That was not done. That could be the main reason
Well, that's obviously the reason. That's clearly the reason. You were the commissioner for India's Food and Drug Administration.
True.
You don't think you bear some of the blame?
I was commissioner in 2011-15. The Indian bureaucracy, they are also trying to find out the sources. Like now the combined COVAX and then of course CPI and all those things. It is there. But when I see the publicly available data, most of the vaccines with the manufacturers are tied up with some country or some program. And that leaves very small space for especially Indian states. Now, some of the states like Maharashtra or Punjab or larger states like Odisha, Uttar Pradesh, they are floating international tenders for accessing vaccines. But unfortunately, the vaccines are not available.
Why do you need to do international tenders if you're the one, it's in Maharashtra, where you are, is where the vaccines are? So isn't this something much more fundamental, this neoliberal policies of big pharma, of the closeness between governments and big pharma and how they operate versus the great success of your neighbor with similar kind of population, the People's Republic of China?
You have to understand the process. The Serum Institute of India, which is the manufacturer for Covishield, AstraZeneca, a variety of it, they are not the research and development entity. They are just licensee of Oxford and AstraZeneca.
But who cares? If it's life or death, they have the vaccine. Who cares who licenses? I mean, do you think, this is life or death for India's population. Surely these issues are they're about money and about rights. Who cares?
Since we are the part of the entire ecosystem of legalities across the world, if there is a legally binding contracts or the legal engagements with for the supply by Serum Institute of India with some other countries, then they have to honor it. It cannot be just like that. And of course, let me tell you one thing.
So honoring the contract is more important than saving the lives of ordinary Indian people?
I am not saying this. See, it is like Indians, they are also getting the COVAX, Covishield. We have also Covaxin, this thing. And of course, now Sputnik 5 is also coming. So they are trying to get it. So Serum is not that the Serum is holding it or supplying it somewhere else. So it has to be like one last factor. Let me tell you one thing. And since I was a commissioner, this is the time when patenting needs to be discussed at the central level of all the major leaders of the world, that whether we should really be doing away with patenting and we should be having like equal distribution of this vaccine all across the world. One country is protected, that doesn't mean that entire planet is protected. So therefore, this is not happening.
In fairness to the Joe Biden administration, he has sought a waiver on patenting and intellectual property rights. Why do you think your old colonial masters here in Europe, Britain, Holland, EU, they don't want any relaxation of the intellectual property rights?
See, it is not as that simple as we see with the WTO and all these things. India is the country that really abides by the international mandate. But in spite of that, I believe that the External Affairs Minister of India is moving around in trying to find out which countries have entered into the agreements and having surplus of vaccinations and whether that surplus can be...
Why not just solve the problem instantly and nationalize all the big pharmaceutical companies in India, like the Serum Institute, and start to actually save the lives of ordinary Indians instead of trying to be contractually obliged by neoliberal organizations like the WTO?
See, Indians are known to do this thing, nationalizations, because when Mrs. Gandhi was the Prime Minister, she overnight nationalized most of the larger banking system, banks in the country at that time. So that's not the problem. The issue is like the Serum Institute doesn't hold license or patent for manufacturing the whole thing.
Surely lives are more important than the scandal of a leak of the formula for the AstraZeneca vaccine. Anyway, let's just move on to this black fungus that apparently is causing a 50% mortality rate for those recovering. for those who have it, and it's to do with the steroid use in hospitals because people have not been vaccinated?
No. It is nothing to do with this. Since I know a little bit of since I myself is a microbiologist, let me tell you something. This mucormycosis is not killing 50%. It's a very small number. In March, just 200 deaths out of the thousands of them. So there is nothing to do with that. It could be like in most of the cases where the patients are diabetic. And in diabetic, if you use steroids, then probably the mucormycosis organism takes over. And then, of course, it is curable. This did not happen during the first wave, but second wave, yes, there are cases. But as it is being projected in the media, it is not as large that problem.
Do you not think that now is the time for some real nationalism in India, as it were? I mean, you're conversant with with what's been happening in agriculture, the fights over the patenting of seeds by big agriculture, let alone big pharmaceutical companies. Do you not think coronavirus is time for reflection for Indian politicians and think tanks to get away from this neoliberal model that comes from Chicago and London and Brussels?
I agree with you. In fact, Joseph Stiglitz' famous statement that's by the 1% of the person and for the 1% that this is happening. And it is moving towards that. Like a very small, minuscule population across the world is now capturing the most of the wealth. And the capitalism is also dying because of this. Now in India, this is for India, a huge chunk of population is still dependent on agrarian economy, which is very difficult to shift it to the services or the industry. And therefore, we need to have a different model, especially on the background of the fourth industrial revolution, when the jobs are going to go down. And as per World Economic Forum, 65% jobs are going to get vanished in the next 10 to 15 years. India, it is going to be worse because being the very large population on agriculture, job market is going to be worse. So we have to be ready, COVID or no COVID, the economic reforms are supposed to be visualized and put in place before some catastrophe visits the country.
Former Commissioner and former Principal Secretary, thank you. And that's it for the show. We'll be back on Wednesday, the day after EU sanctions on UK, US, France-bombed Syria are set to expire. Until then, keep in touch via social media or comment below on YouTube and let us know if you feel supported by your government when it comes to coronavirus.